Well, hello. Chapter 13 is upon us. The global geography of culture. Culture. This is the time in the class where I would normally, stop the lecture and say, "What is culture?" and look all thoughtful and look at you and wait with an awkward silence for someone to raise their hand and say something. And I do that not because I can and it's fun, but because culture is one of those things that every one of us knows about. We live it, we breathe it. It is the way we live in so many ways, but it's one of those things that you can't really define, right? It's hard to define something that is so common and ubiquitous. And so we know what is our culture, we know what is not our culture, but it's hard to really put it into words. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to understand the ideas of cultural regions, how culture spreads, how culture is produced, and how culture is tied geographically to regions, right? So African culture, American culture, European culture, that kind of a thing. So what is culture? Okay. Now, culture is practices that are generally accepted. Um, in this country, right? It is accepted that you will go to school, high school till you're, 18 or 19, and then you'll probably go to college or the very first couple years of college. And so it's accepted that you probably won't, be an adult looking for your full time work, hopefully, until you're in your mid 20s, and maybe you'll get married at your mid 20s and have a child later in life. That's the culture. That's a generally accepted practice. It is generally accepted that women should be educated to the same extent as men. Now, I say generally because we know there are always exceptions, right? So, culture are practices and beliefs, things that are generally accepted. What type of things? Well, material things. Um, we accept that in this culture, right? Men wear shirts in the summer, and so do women. But when we go to the beach, men can take off their shirts and women can't, right? That's a cultural issue in this country. So, material things, the clothing that we wear, the music that we listen to, the food that we eat. But it's also this thing that's a little bit more slippery, the idea of beliefs, ideas, practices. We talked about religion previously. That's a belief that is culturally, connected. And how religion is practiced varies as well. And that's a cultural aspect of religions too. Ideas, right? In our country, there's a belief that, people are all created equal. Everyone should have equal rights. But the idea of what are the rights that should be equal. So equal rights, until the 1860s did not apply to African Americans, Native Americans, or women. And that gradually changed. The idea of equal rights for people of different sexualities is something that is now becoming acceptable in this country. So those things are changeable practices, right? But the point about this is that culture is elastic. It is continually remade. It is not static. So a good example, I made this joke once, that if you were a time traveler, if you could travel any point in time, right, in America's history, if you were to go back much further than the 1960s, then you better be white. Because think about it, if you go back to the 1700s and you're black, it's a different story, right? Culture has changed. Not perfectly, but it does change. It's elastic, and it's continuing to change right now. I'm still trying to figure out what's going to happen with our culture due to the coronavirus quarantine that we're all in. I mean, how many of us now have done things we haven't done or changed the way we act and live and eat, right? Dramatically. So culture also goes with globalization. Okay. So culture is often seen as a resistance to globalization. So the idea of what it is to be American oftentimes is used as a way to resist what is viewed as the loss of being American to other cultures. Make America great again is the thing we hear in the last so many years, with this idea that American culture is being threatened by people from abroad. So culture in some ways is a resistance, and it fuels this. Okay. So in other words, culture is a resistance to and accommodation to wider forces. There are greater things at play, and culture reflects that. So, talking about how culture is elastic, this map on the side here is an interesting story. If I asked you, where is the South in the U.S.? So, a study was asked, what states do you consider to be Southern? And this area that's really light tan got at least one respondent. I think they asked roughly 100 people. So, at least one person in 100 said this. but 91% said this area, and then only 96% said here. So in other words, the idea of what is the South, right, is very elastic. So here are some of the things that are part of culture, right? Culture, language, obviously a very strong, obvious marker. Language, as we talked about in the last chapter, right? Even within your own language, there are different dialects that are cultural. How we call soda or pop, all those terms, which comes to communication. Underneath my face here is the term religion. Religion kind of holds a lot of these cultural aspects: courtesies, rituals, roles, and customs. Courtesies. So when you sneeze in this country, what do most people say? They say bless you. And that actually goes back to a religious aspect. The idea that, way, way, way back when, people were worried that when you sneezed, your soul was leaving your body. Right? But rituals, not only going to church or praying, but this idea of Easter holiday, right? For many people, Christmas shopping, the roles. Religion definitely defines roles for people based on gender, based on age, and customs. Relationships, the way we relate to one another. Okay? And then on a technological, physical level, practices, the way we do things, the way that most of us work in a service industry, right? The idea that a job that involves manual labor is somehow less worthy than a job that involves sitting in an office, or the idea that a job that pays you more money has more worth. That's a cultural aspect. Expected behaviors. The fact that you are all right now sitting here attentively watching this lecture, when I know you're really not. You're home, you're playing games, right? Class, how you behave in a class. Values and thoughts. And the last thing, the manner of how we interact. How do we interact on the streets? I think it's fun to watch this idea of social distancing, right? When people are walking down the street now, do you go 6 feet to the left? Do you go to the right? That kind of a thing. So, because we have different cultures, we can have ideas of different cultural regions. So, right, England, they speak English. It's a cultural region. Or religion, the Middle East, as we call it, which is, the area that is, North Africa, Southwest Asia. That whole area has a common religion and language for the most part with Arabic and Islam. Ethnicity. So there are groups where ethnic ties are the strongest. Or history, a shared history. In this country, we don't really have a religion, but we do have a common language with English for the most part, and history. So different things can define that. So example, we're going to talk about the Mormon West, the South. I've made this joke in class. Are you a North Sider, South Sider, West Sider? That kind of a thing. Now, these cultural regions, you may see them on a map, but the boundaries are fluid. They have a core, the center, and a periphery. Okay? And these boundaries, these cultural regions, they exist through self-identification and external perception. So if I ask you, what neighborhood are you from? And you tell me a neighborhood in Chicago, that's self-identification. You don't have it stamped on your driver's license, but you know where you live and you define that. And some people are very big about, I'm a South Sider, I'm a North Sider. And there's also external perception, right? If you see people when you're downtown here at school, I'm assuming that sometimes you might kind of think they might come from that part of town based on how they look or dress or talk. So there's external rings as well. If you see somebody who is speaking Arabic, right, you might externally think that they are from the Mideast, and they may not be, but that's a perception that is external. Okay. Sometimes it's contentious. Some people don't like how you define it. I think one of the easiest ways to start any kind of argument is to ask somebody, their ethnic heritage, or make them feel as if you're questioning it, because these are complex things. They're not simple. They're not homogenous, right? In fact, I've used this example many times. The perception for many people outside of Chicago is that Chicago's South Side is this, wasteland of gang violence and a decaying, netherworld. When in reality, there are neighborhoods that have high crime, but there are neighborhoods that do not. And the same thing for the North Side as well. So let's look at this idea of cultural regions in the United States. And we're going to use religion as the focus, because we talked about this a little bit before, right? The Mormon culture focuses or centralizes right here in Utah. It spreads a little bit over the boundaries. But in the Mormon religion, right, drinking alcohol or coffee is not allowed. So you see very few coffee shops, very few bars, a very much more what we consider conservative Christian relief in this area. Another way of looking at this also, this area is called the Bible Belt, the South. Very conservative states tend to vote heavily Republican, considered the most conservative area of the country, which coincides with an area that is heavily Baptist. And the Baptist religion has a lot of similar cultural views, so they kind of overlap. Here's another example. Humboldt Park in Chicago. Now, Humboldt Park is an actual park. It's a city park. But oftentimes, it's often called a neighborhood, right? So if you're not familiar with Humboldt Park, it is on North Avenue, west of Western, in the city. But the neighborhood surrounding it is called Humboldt Park. Now, a few years ago, this local news magazine did an article, and they asked people to submit a drawing of what they think their neighborhood is. So what neighborhood do you live in? I live in Humboldt Park. Would you draw what you think the boundaries are? The darker the red had the highest number of agreement. But you can see that it kind of blurs and fades. So Western Avenue right here is usually considered right here part of Bucktown or Wicker Park. But some people consider that Humboldt Park. And who's to say? The city neighborhoods do not have official drawn boundaries. These are basically cultural assumptions. I find it interesting that sometimes real estate agents in this area here who want to sell a house or a condo, instead of calling it Garfield Park for many years, they would call it West Wicker Park, as if that was more desirable, even though it's really the same thing. And that's a cultural assumption, right? So I'm going to pause the video right here and end part one. We'll come back with part two, so feel free to go ahead and get a drink, but remember our mayor, don't go outside.